Today I'm going to be walking you guys through the entire process, start to finish, of how to make pattern plywood. It doesn't cost a lot of money to make, but you will have to have a few basic tools such as a table saw or a drill press in order to make it. As always, if you enjoy this video or find it helpful, please give me a thumbs up, hit that like button, that helps me out quite a bit. If you're interested in any of the tools I'm using, I'll have Amazon affiliate links down in the description so you can go check those out. I'm Clayton, the Weekend Builder. Let's get started.
The idea of pattern plywood is quite simple. You essentially just cut strips out of a sheet of plywood and glue them up together a couple times in a different orientation. So I started with a quarter sheet of plywood. You can get this at your local home improvement center such as Lowe's, Home Depot for about 24 bucks. And I ripped it down the center just to make it a little bit more manageable. Next, I set my fence again and I could start ripping it into strips. Keep in mind when you're doing this that the width of the strips you're cutting are actually the thickness of the end product. Since I was aiming for 1.25 inches, I cut my strips to 1.5 inches. That's going to leave me with some wiggle room when I go to plane it. Once I had that board ripped down into 2-foot strips, I brought my table saw sled over and cut them in half down to 12 inches. Another great way to do this is using a miter saw and setting up a stop block, but this was just easier for me. I wouldn't say that this is better than using a miter saw, but I definitely prefer it. With all of our strips cut, we can move over to our first glue up. After laying them all out, I give them a quick inspection, make sure the best boards are all facing up. Then using a square, I put all the boards at a 45-degree angle. Now, I don't have enough clamps to glue all of these boards up at the same time, so I'm only going to do half at a time. So I make sure that's at 45, use my square, and I draw a line. That line is just for reference when I go to glue it up. This is going to make a little bit more sense in just a second here, but you'll see what I'm talking about. Next, we can add some glue to the back, and don't worry about adding too much. We need to make sure we get a strong connection here. The next step is to stack these together, and this is where that pencil line that we just drew is going to come in handy. Your goal at the end of this should be to have a perfectly straight pencil line from one side all the way down to the other. That's going to mean that these are lined up perfectly at 45 degrees. So now I'll add a few clamps, do the exact same thing to the other pieces, and then let them sit to dry. The next day I came out and used an old chisel to scrape off all of the excess glue. Then I could come by with a handheld belt sander and get it as flat as I could. Preferably, if you had a planer, this would be the time to use it, but unfortunately I don't, so I'm gonna have to borrow a planer later in this project, but for now, this got everything straight enough that I could keep working. Now we're gonna do the same exact thing to this panel that we originally did with the plywood at the beginning. But before we can do that on our table saw, we have to cut a straight line. So I took a leftover piece of plywood and threw on this clamp so I could clamp the piece directly to it and run that along the fence and get a perfectly straight cut. Now that we have a straight line on one side, we can run it through and make our strips. Now the first time we cut these strips, it ended up being the thickness of our end product. But this time, it's going to determine the pattern of our plywood. So I set the fence to be the exact same thickness of the plywood, that way I could get a really nice chevron pattern. And once we had all these strips cut, we're ready for a final glue up. So the first thing I'm going to do is establish my chevron pattern, and I do this by alternating the grain on the different pieces. And now it's rinse and repeat. We're going to turn all the boards over, we'll add some glue, make sure we get some good even coverage, and then we will line them all up. Again, make sure not to skimp out on the glue here. We're gluing up end grain to end grain, and this is naturally not a very strong joint, so make sure that you lather it on pretty thick. Now the only difference between this and the last glue up is that we aren't gluing this one up at a 45. This is because we've already established our pattern, so now we just need to glue the pieces together straight across. After it was all glued up, I threw it in some clamps, waited for it to dry, and then we can get to planing this down. If you're a hobbyist like me, chances are you don't have a planer. So I ended up reaching out to my uncle who had one, and he let me come over and use it. And if you don't know anybody with a planer, you could actually rent the service and go plane your board. Once we got this plane down, we got to see that grain, and it looks so good. So at this point, you've made patterned plywood. You can use this for a host of different things because it looks so good in my opinion. I'm gonna go ahead and use it to make the top for a stool. So if you want to see that process, just stick around and I'll show you. Right now I'm making a router jig so that I can cut a perfect circle on the top of my stool. And this happened. I was being a little bit too aggressive without supporting the plexiglass and it led to a crack. So I tabled the fancy router jig idea for just a minute and kept working. In order for this to work, there needed to be a hole drilled in the exact center of that piece, and we use a locating pin as a pivot so that we can swing this around and make a perfect circle. And for that pin, I'm going to be using these bolt cutters and a nail. Right off the bolt cutters, it's not very round, it's pretty sharp, so we're going to take that over to the grinder and give it a nice round edge. So at this point, I had given up on making some fancy router jig. Instead, I just used the leftover plexiglass, drilled a hole in the center so that the router bit can sneak through it, and then a hole off to the side so that I can put the locator pin through it. Then I threw in a screw on either side of the board to keep it from moving while I was routing. Next, I brought over my router and inserted the pin into the hole, and I could get started with routing. I've already set the bit to the correct depth, so I just lifted the router ever so slightly and then let it down and ran it in a circle. Then I could remove the pin and bore out all the rest of the material. The next thing to do was to cut all the sides off so that I can make it a perfect square. And the reason this is important is because I'm going to be using these corners as a reference to mark out where the legs are going to go. The next step was to flip it over, mark out where those legs were going to land, and then drill out using a Forstner bit that hole for the leg. And I'm going to be using these holes to set the 10-degree angle for my legs to sit in. If you have a drill press, I highly recommend you use that. It's going to be a lot more exact than this plastic jig. And I actually did get a drill press halfway through this project, but I just didn't have it at this time when I was drilling these holes. Next, we're going to cut this into a circle. So I made up this jig using 1/2 inch MDF, a pine 1x4, and the slider from the miter gauge that came with my table saw that I wasn't using. The idea here is to drill a hole and use that locator pin as a pivot to cut a circle on a table saw. So as you can see, I can now insert that locator pin through my workpiece into that new sled, and I can pivot on that point. Now I'm going to cut off a corner, rotate it, cut off the next one, and just keep up with that process until we have a full circle. Then eventually you get to the point where it's round enough that you can hold it in one place and rotate it on the blade to cut that perfect circle. Now that the top is finished, let's work on the legs. Insert jig number 4064. I took off the bottom and screwed it onto a piece of plywood, and then I can clamp that onto my drill press at a 10-degree angle, and this V-shaped piece is going to allow me to drill holes perfectly in the center of my round legs. So I use a speed square to mark exactly where I want all of the holes to land. I bring those over to the drill press and I can start cutting out those holes. And for the legs, I'm using 1¼ dowels with 3/4 inch dowels as the cross pieces. Here's a quick example of how they fit together. Nice tight fit. Now I need to make sure that those cross pieces are the exact width that they need to be. So I do this by inserting the cross piece and then putting it in the holes that I drilled for the legs and checking with an angle setter if it's at 10 degrees. Then I would take it to the miter saw, cut off a hair until I got it to sit perfectly at 10 degrees. And I repeated this for all 4 legs. And once everything was measuring an exact 10 degrees, I did a dry fit to make sure it would all fit correctly. Now I could use my palm sander and sand away any of the burn marks left on there by the table saw and to get it to a nice 220 grit. Then I hand sanded all of my legs to 220 grit as well. And I'm doing this right now because it's going to be much easier to sand before it's all assembled. Then I used my router to chamfer over the edges so that they weren't quite so sharp. Now I used pretty cheap plywood to make this, it was nothing expensive. So there were lots of cracks and voids that I needed to fill, so I mixed up some sawdust from this project and wood glue and filled in all of those different cracks as well as the pivot hole in the center. Then I quickly touched it up with some 220 grit to get rid of the excess, and I was ready for the glue up. This part of the project is pretty self-explanatory. We're going to add some glue, smear it around a little bit with our finger, add some more to the holes in the base, and then connect it all together. After that, I just went around one last time and made sure everything was at 10 degrees. Now all we have to do left before we finish it is cut it to the right height. So once I measured and found out how much I wanted to cut off, I first made sure that the stool was perfectly level with the workbench. I could go around and mark the legs at the top of this spacer block. Next, I use a handsaw to cut the legs at the appropriate height, and if you do this properly, it should leave your bench perfectly level. If it's not, it's only going to take some minor adjustments. You can see here that mine had a little bit of wobble in it, so I threw on some 80 grit sandpaper on my sander and just sanded down those 2 legs just a little bit until I got rid of that wobble completely. But because the palm sander doesn't leave everything perfectly flat, it's a little bit round, I took a piece of 12-inch sandpaper and ran the stool over the top of it to flatten that leg out a bit. Finally, we can go ahead and add some finish to this. I'm using a Behr water-based polyurethane, and I highly recommend it. If you want to pick up this finish and use it on your projects, I'll leave a link in the description to where you can pick that up. Once this finish was dry, I gave it a light sanding at 400 grit, and we could call this project finished.
So that's a wrap for this project. If you made it this far, please consider subscribing. I'm Clayton, the Weekend Builder, and I'll catch you in the next one.